So in Italy, there's all kinds of things happening. Political division. Germany and the Empire, there's no more influence on them at all. There's Lombard Italy is no longer under the influence of the Holy Roman Empire. France and Spain, of course, are fighting to control Sicily and southern Italy. Northern Italy is completely dominated by city-states. So as we're going to see, just a tiny little glimpse into this, and honestly, as I've said all along, every single one slide that we see could become an entire semester-long course, and we absolutely could have an entire semester-long course on 13th and 14th century painting in Italy. Being as this is a survey class, we get to see one or two examples. Perhaps they will pique your interest to study further. Nevertheless, we begin to see individualism. We begin to see great wealth. These are large trade centers. All of these pilgrims that have been coming down throughout the Romanesque era, they're all still there. They're still traveling. They're still spending their money, as well as a great trade. Many of these city-states are on ports. They're able to trade all up and down the coast. So there's large amounts of wealth beginning to amass. So what begins to happen as a result of this is artisans are emerging as artists in the modern sense. They have names and they sign their work. Imagine that. And so they're seen as individuals in their own eyes and also in those eyes of their patrons. So certain patrons are going to start following certain artists. They're going to be spending their money. And the art starts being filled with self-awareness. So the artists are free in a way. They are no longer dependent on whatever church is hiring them to decorate the inside. They have actual patrons and they can take their choice of commissions if they're well known. So the first thing I just want to look at is the Florence Cathedral. Now, this image of the Florence Cathedral is as it is today, and the dome was designed originally by sculptors, and I've said it in this slide. The cathedral was not designed by engineers. It was designed by sculptors who had a vision of what they wanted it to look like, and they had this idea that this dome was to be the dome of heaven, which would separate the clergy. It would separate the main altar from the congregation in the rest of the church, in the nave. So the theme of the church and the congregation being the house of God and the congregation actually representing the body of the church is very apparent. But we have this idea that this dome, that the heavenly connection is very strong over the altar. However, although they designed this beautiful idea, they were unable to build it. And it wasn't until 1420, so 40 or 50 years later, that Brunelleschi came along and was able to figure out how to build this dome. So the dome itself is called Brunelleschi's dome, and we study it in early Renaissance art in the next section. The nave of this cathedral, although it's really hard to tell from this picture because of the size, the immensity of this dome, is actually as tall as the nave in Amiens. But it's 3 times as wide, so it's the width and the solidity that make it stay up. Here is the detail of the pulpit in the baptistry at Pisa, which again, this piece of sculpture was commissioned a little bit later. It's an example of continuous narration. You can see the Virgin in 3 different places here. She's in the center. She's just giving birth. Here is the Christ child down here being washed by the midwives, up above her being kept warm by the shepherds and the ox and the ass. And at the very top, we see the Annunciation, very human reactions, classicizing poses, classicizing drapery, this very compactly twisting and turning figures, again, reminiscent of Roman sarcophagi. It was this classical revival came about in the first half of the 13th century under Frederick II, who was the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. So Paisano is one of the first sculptors to practice this sort of classicizing naturalism in northern Italy. So this is one of our first examples. And this idea filters out throughout Northern Europe, and we've seen some of the results of it in the French and German art that we've looked at already. Now, Andrea Paisano is no relation, by the way, to Nicola Paisano or Giovanni Paisano, but he was commissioned to create these gilded doors. And in your textbook, I think it's around page 600 or so, there's a picture of the entire door with all of the quatrefoils, and you can go online and see them all also. As a matter of fact, I would recommend you with all of these to go online, especially when we get to the Arena Chapel and things like that, within the scope of the images that we have that are available for these PowerPoints. There's no way to give you the variety and the narratives that are told in these stories and these beautiful sculptures that's beginning to blossom at this time. On these doors, we have 28 scenes from the life of John the Baptist. And the doors themselves, which you'll see when you look in your book, they're surrounded with vine scrolls. The whole thing's cast in bronze. And if you look at the figures, this classicizing style is current in Florentine painting. So I'd like to show you the sculptor first, and then we're going to look at some painting from both Siena and Florence. So wall painting was really the preeminent art form in Italy. And I know I've shown you sculpture first, but that's because often painters will work from these sculptures, and they worked from ancient classical sculptors as well. There's a back and forth dialogue between the two art forms. But altarpieces are commissioned for large and for small churches, and this increasingly wealthy society and this competition that these city-states have, who's going to build the biggest, the most beautifully directed church, is very active at this time. In addition, in the 13th and 14th century, we have this Byzantine influence that's being brought into Italian painting by the Crusaders after 1204. So that being said, we have two schools that we're going to look at here, Siena and Florence, and they're rivals in Italian Gothic painting. So we see two separate schools of painting here. So first we'll look at Siena. And so this painting is by a gentleman named Duccio de Boninsegna, which you can know I'm human by my pronunciation. So I will say that. Beautiful color, very brilliant palette. And again, I would encourage you to go online and look at some details of this painting. You can see this Byzantine iconographic sort of composition, these layered figures. It's still very, very flat. There's not a lot of sense of space here. And the convention of this painting with the mother and child in the center with this solemnity, but around these surrounding figures begin to show more of this naturalism that's coming forward, this courtly style. So it's sort of a conglomeration of these two things coming together, and these become hallmarks of this Sienese school of painting. This is a painting by Simone Martini, and he may or may not have assisted Duccio. This is a little bit later, and we really begin to see this naturalism coming forward now. We still don't have a whole lot of a sense of space or perspective, but look at the beautiful treatment of the faces, the draperies, the hands holding the flowers, the beautiful drawing of the water lilies, the details and the ornamentation of the architecture. So the Italian Gothic court style, very similar to the French court style that we've seen. So we're beginning to see some flavors that are going to become, and this is why it begins to be called the international style, although there's the lines are blurred between 13th and 14th century painting and international style, and scholars differ on the nomenclature. So again, Martini did study in France. He had a workshop in Avignon. So he had a huge influence on what was later called international style. And again, that's a forerunner to early 15th century Northern Renaissance art. Now, the Lorenzetti brothers, also Sienese, are working in a much more solid style, which comes out later in the 14th century. This is a really good example of it. You can see the solidity to these figures. They're firmly anchored to the ground, very carefully drawn, solid outlines, and notes the completely modern dress, the completely modern interior, the washing of the Christ with the midwives below Mary, the Byzantine gold halos, just a trace of them seen on the figure of Mary, but she's on this plaid bed in a modern bedroom, and we're just beginning to see the use of some perspectival space here. At this time, there's a great deal of civic pride, and this image, the allegory of good government in the city and allegory of bad government in the city, although I don't have the images of the allegory of bad government, are in the Sala de Placia in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, which is the public civic building, which is the bell tower, and you can see an actual depiction of that building in this image. The bell tower is way back over here. So the theme of these paintings is a contrast between the effect on people's lives of good government and bad government. The idea being, as you see in this scene, all of the people are shopping, they're happy, they're prosperous. You can see on the wall, and you can just see on the very right-hand side, people going in and out of the gate. And in the next slide, we'll see the continuation of this. It's all one long mural. The people dancing in the streets, that under good government, we have this very happy, prosperous public in the city. So in the good government in the country, again, we can see that edge of the city over on the left, and we see all of the goods being brought in from the countryside, that the relationship from the city and the country is a good, it's a peaceful, a prosperous one in which the two are feeding the other and supporting one and the other. Now, in Florence, this transformation of this Italo-Byzantine style begins a bit earlier than in Siena. And so this Cimabue, his real name was Ceni de' Pepi, you might say he's Duccio's counterpart in Florence, that he had the same reputation, the same thriving business in Florence that Duccio had in Siena. Here's an early painting by Cimabue. And again, it's got this iconographic style to it, but Cimabue is already showing us a little bit more perspective in the figures. He is already giving us a solid seating on this throne. The figures, although they're still stacked, the figures below are set within their space. But Giotto is the main figure that we're going to look at from Florence. And so you can see Cimabue's and the Byzantine influence in this early painting by Giotto. And if you go back to the earlier slide, which I will do right here, so note the composition. We have the Virgin and Child in the center, this central composition surrounded by the angels and saints. However, in Giotto's painting, the Virgin and Child now have been given an architectural setting, and the angels and saints around them are facing inward, and rather than being stacked, they're overlapping one behind the other. And there are definitely the two angels in the foreground are looking back and up at the Virgin and the Child. The figures are solid. The infant has lost most of its infant characteristics and proportions, and this reflects this struggle of showing a divinely born child with his mother, so they become symbols for something greater, of course. Fully three-dimensional beings in space here, and this foreshadows his later work. I'm including this painting here, even though we really don't know who the painter was. He's just been given the name St. Francis Master. Some scholars say Giotto painted it, some scholars say his followers painted it, but it's a continuation of this idea of somewhat naturalistic style and figures within space. This is the Last Judgment from the Arena Chapel, and it's the last paintings that we're going to look at from Florence and from Italian painting. It's known as Giotto's masterpiece, and I've only got 2 slides of it here for this video, and I'm going to give you a little assignment, which is to go online and find a wonderful video of it. The Khan Academy has some great ones. There's a lot of sources. The Arena Chapel itself has wonderful sites and videos devoted to going through the entire painting program of this chapel. The whole entrance wall is covered with the scene of the Last Judgment. So you'll be coming in this door, but you don't see the Last Judgment until you turn around and leave. And the entire ceiling is covered with moons and stars. The side walls have images of the virtues and vices, and of course, narrative themes from the Old and New Testaments. So Giotto created an entire graphic odyssey, if you will, within this chapel. Masterly ability for modeling form with color. So here's a close-up view of one of his paintings. So they're all inset in groups of 4 and in narrative order. So this particular work is the Lamentation, and it's from the lower register of the Arena Chapel. So a couple of things you can notice about this. For one thing, if you notice the stark outlines around the figures, and this is because it's painted in a wet fresco technique that dries really, really fast. So they literally had to only paint a certain amount of a section in a day, wait for it to dry, and then paint the next one the next day. So you see the outlines of each figure being painted within its lines. In addition, you can notice around the angels, the putti, and the lines in the blue, the varying shades of blue. Again, that reflects different days of painting where they did their best to match the blue, but it was never exactly the same. So, of course, over the centuries, it will fade. We can see real human suffering here, very naturalistic treatment of the Christ's body, that he's got weight to him as they hold him up, the slightly bloated. We see suffering and sorrow in the faces of the figures, solidity in their gestures. So this Florentine's painting, this is a cornerstone, fundamental to the development of the Italian Renaissance. And when we start art history 2, we look at these images again as our foundation to move into art from the Renaissance through modern art of the 20th century. The last 2 slides we're going to look at are from the International style. The first one, this is from France, so we've gone back to France. This is the Martyrdom of Saint Denis. So we have this merging of Northern and Italian traditions, and it's a single dominant style that runs throughout Western Europe. The subject matter of this one is actually equalizing the saint's martyrdom with the crucifixion. So now there's this idea that we've seen in these, studying these relics, almost at this point giving the saint a divine status here. So it's a new kind of a realism, a new way of using symbolism. We have the mass of the Italian painting that we've seen from Giotto, and this beautiful grace that we've seen in, for example, the Virgin and Child from Saint Denis, that sculpture. Our last slide is an image from the Book of Hours. The artists are Paul de Limbourg and his brothers, who all died of the plague. So we have very, very little work for them. And, that can kind of give us a side note of if there had not been a plague, how different the trajectory of art history would have been. Because along with the 40% of all the population of Europe, of course, that includes 40% of all artists. So the ones that were left were much fewer, much far between. Therefore, their individual styles had such a great impact on all of the style moving forward. In this book, and again, I would send you to the internet to find all of, because there's a page, of course, for every month. This particular one is the month of October. So we're seeing the sowing of winter grain. Again, natural subjects, synthesis of style, precursors for the Renaissance here. So that concludes our study of Western art history from prehistoric art through the international style in the early 14th century. I really hope you've enjoyed these lectures, and I hope that they inspire you to study more art history. I know that I've enjoyed giving them, and I wish I could meet all of you, but I hope that you love a little bit of art history as much as I do now, and maybe you even see it a little bit differently. Thank you.